With Unreal Engine 5.6, we obviously need to talk about some render settings. So, if you've never rendered in Unreal Engine before, my typical approach is what you see is what you get. Typically, whatever you see in your viewport, it's pretty good, and I use these render settings across all of my commercials as a freelance motion designer, cinematographer, whatever you want to call me, whatever I do. These are the settings that I use to make client work. So, that being said, let's go ahead and talk about getting started with rendering in Unreal Engine. The first things first is you definitely need a scene to render out a shot. So I have this little shield that I modeled. I have some gradient backdrops which will help with demonstrating some of the examples that I have to show on how to get the best render quality out of Unreal. So first things first, if you've never rendered in Unreal Engine before, you need something called a level sequence. To do that, you're going to go up either to this clapboard up here and add a level sequence, or you can right click in the empty space of your content browser and go to Cinematics, Level Sequence, and add RTUT sequence, whatever you want to call it. Control Shift S to save it. Double click on that, and now we have a level sequence. But the problem is this won't render because we need a camera. So first what we're going to do is we're going to hit the camera button right here, and this will create a camera inside our level sequence. We can go ahead and select this, maybe zero it out on the rotation, set the Z value to -90 on the rotation, and then we can set our focus distance like so. I'm assuming that if you're watching this video, you're already at the point where you're ready to render a shot. So from here, you make sure that you set your in point, which is going to be this green bar, and your out point with this red bar, and then you go ahead and start doing the render stuff. So I'm going to jump over to the other sequence I have that I was using for my tests. So sequences, render demo, and we can go ahead and see that I have this cool little shield that I modeled, and it's doing a 360 spin. Amazing. So with that out of the way, now that you know how to render or start a sequence, let's talk about rendering this. In Unreal Engine 5.6, they introduced a new feature, and that is using the quick render button up here. So if you click on these three dots right here, it'll give you all the options under the quick render settings. So before we actually click on the quick render button, we're going to go ahead and go to the quick render settings, and we can see here that what it's going to do is it's going to render our current sequence, which is right here, followed by our movie render graph config, which is by default it's going to be set to this quick render graph right here, and then you're going to also be able to set your output directory, which is going to be your output folder, and then your output resolution. You could set this to 1920 by 1080, you can set this to 4K, whatever you want to do. So I'm just going to go ahead and save this directly in this folder, and if we hit this button with the default settings, I'm going to go ahead and delete some of the changes I've made. By default, it will look exactly like this, and these settings is basically going to render a JPEG sequence into some generic folder, and I know nodes are scary, but all this is saying is warm up the render, load the game, then we're going to make sure that we're brute forcing the highest quality settings possible, and we're going to make sure we save it inside this folder. Now, as far as what the game or what Unreal is going to load, it's loading up whatever the viewport sees. That's what we're going to see with deferred rendering, and it's going to render a JPEG sequence, and it's going to create this render layer. Now, render layers is a little bit more complex. You don't need to change any of this stuff, but if you go ahead and close this and you just hit the quick render button, it will go ahead and load up a render on your screen that looks kind of like this, and it'll just start spitting out a render. It'll start spitting out a JPEG sequence. Now, the issue with this is you're going to get a pop-up of just the image, because the quick render settings by default will be say, hey, let's play this render. But the problem is the Windows picture viewer doesn't render a level sequence. It doesn't render an image sequence. So we just get a giant folder of images that we have to deal with, which is actually kind of annoying. So that being said, now let's talk about if you just wanted the absolute most simple, you don't even want to have to think about it, render settings possible. What you're going to do is under the three dots for your quick render settings, you're going to go to your quick render settings right here, and we're going to go to the default quick render graph. Now, in the empty space of the scary nodes, we're going to right click and type MP4. We're going to find this node right here, just click that, and then if we go ahead and take this deferred render pipe and then take that, put it in there, take this, put it there, and we don't change anything else. We hit the save button, we close this, and we hit the render button. It's going to go ahead and load up our render again and do the exact same thing. But the benefit about Unreal Engine 5.6 is it now has the ability to render with H.264 MP4, so you could just take this video and post it directly to the internet. However, I do want to call out a couple things about this. Let's take a look at this frame right here, and we can see that there's some pretty gnarly banding happening on this gradient. Versus if I go to my folder of the JPEG sequence, which is right here, I have my image sequence, and let's go ahead and load up this image. Let's put this guy over here. Let's look at this image over here. The JPEG does not have the banding versus the MP4 does. And you can fix this a little bit in post if you're using After Effects or DaVinci Resolve, but let's be real, on social media, are people really going to be able to see this? So for quick previews, the quick render settings is actually pretty awesome, but you do need to be conscious that you can get better settings if you do use image sequences and you actually do some of the compositing in post. So that being said, let's go ahead and talk about how to get some better render settings out of Unreal. Now, before we get started in talking about render settings, I want to tell you a couple things that Unreal Engine 5.6 has changed so you don't run into any weird issues. The first is that when you start up an Unreal Engine project, you don't have the ability to turn on ray tracing as is. So if you want to use ray tracing and you use ray trace shadows and some extra bells and whistles, you have to go to Edit, Project Settings, go to the search bar of your project settings and type hardware. And you want to make sure that you scroll down and find support hardware ray tracing. I found that this was turned off, so make sure this is turned on and you will be forced to restart Unreal, and you will have to recompile shaders, so it may take a second to boot that up. Now, if you're halfway through a project and your project already looks fine, I may not recommend doing this because it may change some things, but just so you know, be warned about that. So once that's enabled and restarted, this will also give you the ability to turn on your path tracer. Now, we're not going to talk about the path trace render today, but if you do want to look at your path tracer, if you do not have support ray trace checked for your project settings, you won't have this option here. But because I have path tracing and support hardware ray tracing turned on, I can enable it, and now we have a different type of render based on path tracing versus traditional Unreal 5.6 Lumen. So that's something to consider. Now, another thing that's worth addressing is if we look at this shadow down here, it's a shadow. It looks like a shadow. Amazing. But if you don't have ray tracing enabled, you won't be able to look up ray trace shadows. So under your search bar right here of this rectangular light, which is going to be my key light on this shield, if I type ray, we can see here that I have cast ray trace shadows, and right now it is currently disabled. But if I set this to enabled, it will give me a different shadow. Now, it kind of looks like it disappears, but because ray trace shadows are calculated differently, it's just because the size of my light, if I go ahead and leave my camera and hit G on the keyboard, the size of my light is pretty large, and the larger the light source, the softer the shadow will be. So if I go ahead and set the source width and height to, let's say, 50 and 50, we can see here that the shadow is back, but when I look through, the shadow, in my opinion, from ray tracing does look a little bit more pleasing to the eye, but again, depending on the performance of your project needs, you may want to stick with using traditional shadows that are vanilla in Unreal. So I'm just going to go ahead and set this back to my default disabled shadow, and I'm going to set this light back to its original size that I had for my render as we got started with this video, and now we can actually start talking about render settings. So if you want to use the H.264, if you want to use the easiest render settings, I do still recommend using the movie render queue. Now, before we do get any further, I want to let you know that I'm going to shamelessly self-plug. I do have my render presets linked in the description down below, and in it you will get a folder that you can import into your Unreal Engine project that has all of my render settings that I use across all of my projects, and it will include some of the basics for quick renders with H.264 if you just don't want to think about it. But what I do need to mention with this is that when you load up any of the H.264 settings, you're going to have the ability to change the quality. Now, if you go into the quality settings of your H.264, you can see here that there is a couple options for setting the bitrate. So you have quality or you have your variable bitrate. Now, this is, for some reason, someone at Epic thought this was a good idea, where quality, you would think that you would want to set this to a higher number. But no, in fact, if you set this to a higher number, the render settings will actually look worse. So in my test, I would set this to like 50, and it looked like this. It was weird and gross. I was like, what the heck is going on? Versus if you set this to a lower value of 16, which is, if you mouse over, it'll tell you where 16 is the highest quality possible and 51 is the lowest quality possible. So for some reason, quality is inverse. But if you also want to make it easier for your brain to think, if you set the encoding rate control to variable bitrate, I do recommend setting your average bitrate to 4 times your frame rate. And I'm getting this from another video editor who is Matt Johnson, who renders a lot of stuff in DaVinci and Adobe Premiere, and that's typically his practice and what I use when it comes to rendering with a variable bitrate in DaVinci Resolve and After Effects and Premiere. So that being said, if you want the easiest settings possible when it comes to rendering with H.264, I do recommend using the movie render queue, and that involves setting your bitrate to either quality and the lowest settings, which we'll go through now. So let's say you want to render this shot and you don't want to use the actual quick render settings. We're going to hit the clapboard right here, and now we're going to go into our basic movie render queue settings. So I'm going to go ahead and clear config, and this is what you'll see whenever you hit the clapboard whenever you start rendering a shot. Now, if you click on the unsaved config, you'll see the default settings, and if I just go ahead and hit accept and hit render, it's going to go ahead and render this shot, and it's going to do some weird nonsense because we don't have a couple things in the scene. This is not going to work because why is there a sphere there? So how do we fix this? First, if you want the easiest render settings possible, I will delete the JPEG sequence, and we're going to add a couple things. The first we're going to add is our game overrides, and that will basically brute force to the highest quality settings possible, regardless of what Unreal thinks we should use for our graphics card. Now, if you have like a super old graphics card, this may be a very slow render, so be warned, but I do recommend starting with adding game overrides for most scenarios. Then after that, we're going to go ahead and add an H.264 setting. From here, you can set the quality to either a lower number of like 16 to 20, or you can set the variable bitrate from, I don't know, 50 to 100. Somewhere in that range will be a good spot. And then after that, we want to add anti-aliasing. Now, when we do that and we set our anti-aliasing settings, the only thing that I change is the temporal sample count. I will start with this as a sample of 8 samples. After that, I will override my anti-aliasing. I will render my warm-up frames. I will make sure that my anti-aliasing method is set to none, and under advanced, I will set my render warmup count to 48, and then my engine warmup count to 48 as well. And the reason why you would do something like this is if you're doing something a little bit more advanced, like visual effects, compositing, Niagara, etc., you might need a little extra time for the engine to cook. So with that being said, you have your render settings. You can go ahead and hit the render local button, and you're going to get a render that's going to start getting spit out. Now, this will take longer, about 8 times longer, because it's generating all these frames like so, but it's going to combine it all into a single MP4 that you can go ahead and post on the internet if you wanted to. And that's going to look like this. But that being said, let's go ahead and start talking about what I would use as a production artist who's actually making stuff. And I might do some post-processing afterwards. So to get started with a new fresh render, we're going to go ahead and select our unsaved config. Now I'm going to show you what I would typically do in a setting where I actually want to do a preview for a client. I want it to be a little bit more high quality, but it's not going to be my highest render settings. And sometimes it actually ends up being my final render settings if my client doesn't say anything and I think it looks good enough. So that being said, I will delete the JPEG sequence, and just because I'm an After Effects artist, I typically like working with PNG sequences. That's just how my brain works. I will go ahead and set anti-aliasing and set my temporal count from 8 to 12 normally. And if I have to go beyond that, then sometimes I might go back to the scene and adjust some of my settings. Again, I will set my anti-aliasing method to none, make sure I'm overwriting, render warm-up frames, and then I will set this to 48 and 48. And then I will also add my game overrides. And then with that, I'm pretty much done with those settings, and then I would go ahead and render this out. Now, from here, what you would do if you don't want to download my presets, which they are linked down below, you can go ahead and take these render settings and click on the unsaved config in the top right hand corner of the render settings window, and then go ahead and save a preset. So we can just save this preset as my render settings, and then go ahead, and now we have our render settings, and we can go ahead and render that. Now, these are in 1920 by 1080. So if you wanted to render something in 4K, you would just go to the Output tab and then set this to 3840 by 2160, like so. And then if you needed to change the folder in which you save your render settings into somewhere else on your computer, let's say you're working on a bigger project, you would hit these three dots and save it somewhere on your computer. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. I have a folder, I'll call this PNG demo 4K 8 1x8 samples. Cool. Let's go ahead and hit accept and hit render. And that is going to take a little bit longer. We can see that these frames down here are cooking a little bit slower because I'm rendering a 4K image that's going to be much, much larger. It's basically double the size of a 1920 by 1080 image, and it's much larger than our viewport that we see in Unreal. So this just needs to take some time to render, so I'm just going to let this go ahead and cook and come back in just a few minutes. Now, after a little bit, that render is done. It looks like this, and it looks fine. It looks great. It's a 4K render. Awesome. Now, what if you wanted to render something in vertical format? Now, you could do this using the quick render settings, and you would do that by going on the three dots up here, go to the quick render settings, and then let's go ahead and navigate to the default quick render settings. And first thing you would have to do is go into your global output settings here, and then check your output resolution and invert the X and Y values. So this would be 1080 by 1920. Let's make sure we unselect the chain there, and then 1920. And then I would select adapt resolution and set this to automatic. Now, I've spent some time playing with this, and I don't fully like how it works, so I may not end up using it this way, and I do recommend using the movie render queue. But one thing you also have to do with this is after you set this here, you have to go, regardless, you have to go into your camera settings and invert the film back settings here so that this is now in a vertical aspect ratio. So let's set this to 20.25 by 36 and I know that because the sensor height and width are just being inverted. And then from here, I can go ahead and take a preview of my render and just go ahead and quick render that. And we can see here that we are rendering our shot, and it's looking great. It's looking fine. It's vertical. But my issue with this is that when I see this, it's okay, great. It's a vertical shot. But if I actually go into that render and find that actual shot, I have that shot here, and I found it under the file save of this Unreal project, under the saved folder, and then under movie renders, I have the vertical shot. And sure, it looks like a vertical shot. It looks pretty great. But the problem I have with it is if I hit Alt-Enter on the keyboard and look at the properties of it, and I go to my details panel, we can see that the frame width and height is 608 by 1080, and it's just doing some weird stuff. So what I do recommend is if you do need to render in a vertical format, instead, I recommend using the movie render queue. So to do that, you're going to go to your clapboard, go to your my render settings, whatever you made, and just make sure you invert these. So we'll set this as 1080 by 1920, and then let's go ahead and just render this as a MP4 for now, just for posterity's sake and demonstration purposes. Hit accept, hit render local, and then it's going to go ahead and cook your shot. So let's wait a second. And when that's done, we can go ahead and select our output folder here, find that shot, and it's going to be at the very bottom. And we're going to see that if we select this option, double click that, obviously it's a vertical render, which is great, but I can hit Alt-Enter and then go to my details panel and see that the frame width and height is 1080 by 1920. So based on my tests here, it looks like the movie render queue will just be a little bit easier to manipulate the aspect ratios if you're trying to do professional social media content. Okay, I know we're getting to a long video, so now I want to just quickly blow through my render settings that I use for my commercial projects. Now, this may not be the best for your project, but this is when I just want to show you what I use. So, first things first, I'm going to right click in the empty space of my content browser, and I'm going to go to miscellaneous, and I'm going to add an OCIO or open color IO configuration, and we'll call this OCIO underscore tut. And the reason why we're going to do this is because we need to make sure that we're getting the best color settings possible out of Unreal. So with that being said, fortunately with Unreal Engine 5.5 and onward, it does come with a default OCIO config. Now, if you're a beginner, you don't really need to know this, but it is going to help with some extra color grading things in post. So if you're interested, I do recommend sticking around. So that being said, we have our desired color spaces. We need to hit this button twice, and under the index 0, we're going to go ahead and set this to ACES CG. I just like to have it there. And then we also need a linear and linear Rec 709 sRGB right here. Now, the reason why we put these two is we're going to be rendering in these render settings for the ones I use, but when we're working in Unreal, we need to be working with something called the desired display views. So we're going to hit the plus sign a couple times, and under the index 0, we're going to set this to Rec 709 display, ACES 1.0 SDR video, and then we can also set this to sRGB display with ACES 1.0 SDR video. Now we want to make sure we turn these on, but we're not going to be rendering in these settings. They're just for our viewport. So with that, I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to go ahead and close this, and let's go to my sequencer here. Now I'm going to show you my render settings that I use most of the time. So I'm going to go ahead and clear this config and start from scratch. I will delete the JPEG sequence. I will go to my settings. I will add anti-aliasing. I will go to my settings again. I will add an EXR sequence. And first, I will set my compression from PIS to DWA or DWAB. If you're doing something more advanced, I'll make another video on that, but you may want to use PIS for that. But for most people, just doing some basic color grading, DWA or DWAB is fine. Okay, cool. Under settings, we're also going to add a color output. And then also, we're going to go ahead and add a game overrides. So these are the basic settings that I include in most of my renders between DWA and DWAB, deferred rendering, anti-aliasing, color output, and game overrides. First off with anti-aliasing, I set my spatial count to 1, temporal count to 8 starting out. Sometimes I'll go to 12, sometimes I'll go to 16, but I don't typically go beyond that. If I'm going beyond that, I will render with the path tracer or use something like Cinema 4D and Redshift or Blender and Cycles instead. That being said, I will also override my anti-aliasing, set my anti-aliasing method to none. I will render my warm-up frames, and I'll set this to 120 and 120. And the reason why I do that is sometimes I do some Niagara things and I want to really make sure that my render is cooked. This is going to be the longest render settings, but it will likely give you better results, depending. But sometimes PNG sequences are fine. That being said, once the anti-aliasing settings are set, I will go to my color output, and under the MISC tab, we're going to go ahead and untwirl all of these properties here. Now, I'm going to go ahead and enable OCIO config, and we're going to go ahead and find our configuration source and find our OCIO tut. Now, from our transform source, we're going to go from linear Rec 709 to ACES CG. Now that's important because when we render, it's going to render in the ACES color space. But it will look a little different from your viewport unless you do one thing. And if you go into your viewport and you go to your lit mode, you're going to see this OCIO display, and you're going to have this ability to turn on your enable display. So let's turn this on, and I currently have an OCIO configuration already enabled because I was doing some tests, but you will want to select the tut one that you just made, and you'll probably get a big scary error that looks like this. But that's okay. All we need to do is set the input, which is going to be the top value, to linear Rec 709, and then the bottom value to either Rec 709 or sRGB. And you will know that depending on how you are rendering your video in After Effects or DaVinci or Adobe Premiere. So I typically render in Rec 709, and we're going to get this look. Now this does look a little bit more flat. I personally like this look. I feel it looks a little bit more cinematic, whatever that means. It's a little bit more faded, looks a little bit more filmic. But again, this is up to you and how you want to work. But if you're rendering with EXRs, as in my render settings here, I do recommend working in this space. And the reason why you set up your enable display is if we want our viewport to look exactly like our final render, this is how I recommend working. So you do all of your lighting and all of your materials and colors while working in the lit mode enabled OCIO display, viewing it in Rec 709 or sRGB, depending on where you are rendering into for your final output. So that being said, let's go ahead and hit the render button right here. Everything is set, and I am going to go ahead and keep this at 1920 by 1080 so I don't blow up my computer. Let's go ahead and hit accept, and we can go ahead and hit the render local button. Now, it's going to look a little funky in your viewport. That's okay. Be patient. When we get to DaVinci Resolve, we'll be able to fix this. And while this renders, I think it is worth addressing that at this point in my creative career, I've stopped using console variables. While they are awesome, when you're on social media, and I do a lot of social media content using Unreal Engine, no one can really tell. And my job is to get renders to my clients as fast as possible. And a lot of the time, that extra like 0.001% doesn't make enough of a difference versus making my client happy. So that being said, I don't use console variables all that much. But if you do want to use them, I do have some of those in my render settings in my presets link down below. That being said, let's go ahead and talk about all these renders in DaVinci Resolve. All right, so we're in DaVinci Resolve, and we're looking at some of these renders. So the first one we have is the JPEG default settings. It looks fine, and it looks great, awesome. And if we go back to Unreal, we can see here that I have the OCIO enabled, but if I go ahead and disable that, this viewport looks pretty close to pretty much identical to this JPEG sequence as far as my colorblind eyes can see, so I'm good with that. Let's be real, a JPEG sequence out of Unreal is pretty good a lot of the time, especially after you add some anti-aliasing. So that being said, let's talk about the H.264 settings and the default H.264 using a quality of 20 or lower or a variable bitrate of 100 will look pretty decent. Awesome. Now, I did go through and create an example of rendering with a higher value for the quality of Unreal Engine MP4 renders, and for some reason, someone at Epic thought it was going to be a good idea to set the quality to be inverse. I don't understand it, but that's okay. That's just what that's what they wanted to do. So sure, okay. But if you set the variable bitrate to a value of 100, we can see that we have a really nice looking render here. Now, it's worth addressing that this file size is actually going to be a lot larger than the original H.264. So for example, if I go ahead and right click, go to Find in Media Pool, right click, go to Open File Location, and I go ahead and look at this file here, hit Alt Enter, we can see that this is 57 megabytes. Versus if I look at the quality, much lower quality one, obviously it's 33 kilobytes right here, versus if I go to this version, which is the quality of 20, it's only 6.5 megabytes. So it's worth addressing that this higher quality variable bitrate render does not have as much banding as this render does. And I probably can't even tell you if there is banding because YouTube compression is hot garbage sometimes, but having a higher bitrate will help for your H.264 renders if you do increase the variable bitrate or have a lower quality number. Now, I'm going to show you the PNG basic settings, and typically the reason why I like using PNG sequence out of Unreal is that there's no banding. It looks great, awesome, and I can play this back, and then when I render this out of DaVinci, I can adjust more settings to make sure I don't get banding on social media. Now, we have our JPEG sequence and the render settings that I use. So this is an example of the render settings that I use without any extra color stuff, not using EXRs, but this looks very close to what I have in Unreal when I set my lit mode from OCIO display off to OCIO display on. And we can see that it's a little bit more flat. I don't want to say flat, it's not quite as contrasty, and this is pretty close. I can't tell a difference based on my colorblind eyes. You tell me in the comment section. Where's my Unreal? There it is. I'd say that looks pretty close. Now, when it comes to JPEG sequences, the problem is that they are 8-bit images, meaning they don't have a lot of color depth for you to do color grading. So if you go to my actual settings and download my presets and use my ACES color workflow, etc., and we go to the color tab, we can see that the EXR sequence by default will come in looking like this super dark, super contrasty image, whether you're in After Effects, DaVinci Resolve, or Adobe Premiere, because it's working in a linear color space. So to fix this, what we need to do is hit Alt-S on the keyboard and make sure we have a node in our node graph. And we're going to set this to ACES Transform. If you don't see the ACES Transform, go to your library, search ACES, drop that on like so. Now we need to select an ACES version. So first, we know that we rendered this in ACES CG. So I'm going to go to my input transform and hit A on the keyboard, ACES, and find ACES CG, and output this to Rec 709 BT.1886. And now we're going to get something that looks much closer to our Unreal Engine viewport. In fact, I'd say that looks pretty much on par. However, I will make a very slight adjustment. I will make an addendum. These look pretty close, but if you bounce between them, there's a little bit of color shifting. And some magic is happening beyond my pay grade when it comes to the Unreal Engine conversion of ACES. And on top of that, the ACES version that you're using will also do some weird things. So what I found is that if we set the ACES version to the ACES 1.2, versus 2.0, we can see that there's a little bit of a color shift, but we're still using the same viewport transform. But if we look at our waveform down here, we can see that the waveform is pretty much identical, except we're getting a little bit nicer of a fall off in the highlights and shadows. And because the JPEG doesn't have as much color depth, we're getting a little bit of grain there, versus if we look at our EXR, yeah, that looks a lot sharper. So these are the render settings that I use, and when I'm rendering out of DaVinci Resolve, I'm using the ACES 1.2, converting into ACES CG using Rec 709, and that's pretty much good enough for me. So I know this is a very long-winded tutorial talking about all of the new render settings in Unreal Engine 5.6. I hope you learned something. If you did, let me know in the comment section down below. Questions, comments, concerns, whatever else. Comment section is down there for that as well. And as I said in the description, my render presets are down there. And to be completely honest, it'll probably be part of some sort of marketing thing where you'll probably get some emails from me about maybe selling some stuff, or I actually have a podcast. Let's be real, we live in the modern day of social media, so we do these things so we can help support creators like myself to help create more things on the internet. So I hope it's okay if I do ask on my render presets for your email address to hopefully send you some cool stuff. I promise I will not spam. Probably going to be mostly my podcast, and then maybe when I launch my Unreal course at some point, you'll get that as well. So okay, that's it. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, as always, 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight to make some gains. Goodbye, my friends. Bye.